Hi, my name is Stephen Darty, and what I'd like to talk about is spoiler alert. Let's begin this video by saying this is going to be, it's about the ending of Avengers Endgame, so massive spoilers the size of, Canis Majora, or that whatever that star is that's the big as a solar system. But long story short, this is about the end of a long story, and how it is that, in particular, Captain America shows up where he happens to show up in the story, in the way that he shows up. So, let's call the first theory the braid theory. Now, it is our habit as viewers to privilege our own frame of reference, which is to say, we like to think that whatever story we're watching, we are the ones who are, are in the right place, and it's somebody else who showed up out of nowhere, jerks. But what we're talking about here, we're making the essential story goes like this. The Avengers discover time travel. Only this brand of time travel, this is after the snap. If you're, this is a point at which I might say you might want to be familiar with the events of Avengers Infinity War, where at the end of everything, half the population of the entire universe, not just the Earth, the entire universe is snapped away by the evil Thanos. So he succeeds in that, and the first part of the Endgame is them killing him, but only after discovering to their horror that he destroyed the Infinity Stones, making it impossible for them to just unsnap the people who've just been snapped to death. So they can't get everybody back. They can't wish everybody back to undo what Thanos had done. So that's not going to be the story of this particular movie. It isn't going to be, they fight a second war and then they defeat Thanos and take his glove and then snap everybody back. No, that's not going to be how it starts. In fact, it basically amounts to, an empty sort of vengeance. He's dead in the first third, and that's it. Sorry. However, we show up, 5 years later, our friend Scott Lang from Ant-Man shows up, and, he's traveled 5 years into his future, and now he's basically saying, I think I've discovered time travel here. For me it was like five hours, nothing, or 5 minutes, or however long it was. But he thinks he brings this to the Avengers, and Banner is the one who basically tells him, okay, this is possible, given what you've shown me. But if you go back and you change the event, you go back and you strangle Thanos as an infant, you will get an alpha. I'm using my own terms here, but essentially, you will return to our alpha universe, and it won't be changed by what you did in the past here. What will instead happen is that a beta universe will split off, and in that beta universe, that will be the universe in which you'll have done a very altruistic thing for that universe by killing Thanos, but this universe won't get to enjoy the benefits of that. So this is the basis for why it's so confusing that Captain shows up in the end, having gone back in time and lived with Peggy Carter. I mean, in essence, it's like, we would expect that if he did that, we'd just never see him again, because he's literally in his own little world, which split off from our alpha universe. He's in the beta universe now. So he goes back to restore the stones, because the Ancient One tells him that if you don't put the stones back pretty much where they're supposed to be, when they're supposed to be, bad things happen to that timeline. So ugly things, you don't want that to happen. So somebody has to go back and put those stones back in their right place, and the person that falls to is Steve Rogers. But Steve Rogers, we get a scene in one part where he has, he and Tony Stark, they infiltrate a SHIELD base looking for the Cosmic Cube, because they lost it in the main Avengers movie point that they go back to first. They lose it through a series of errors, including making the Hulk take the stairs, which he doesn't like. But long story short, they're there. He sees Peggy Carter, and seeing Peggy Carter, he's filled with longing for the romance they never got to. Never got to have. And so, when he goes back in time at the end of Avengers Endgame to put the stones back in their place, he decides to, at whatever point, we're not told explicitly what point he decides. Well, maybe we are, but I'm not sure. I think he goes back to the 1940s after everything is said and done. But he decides to live out the rest of his life, as Mr. Peggy Carter. Mr. Agent Carter. And shows up old and licensed on a park bench, obviously no longer capable of being the exuberant youth he was. All that said, that creates a bit of a paradox, because guess what? You're not supposed to be able to affect your future timeline. I mean, and I think this would apply even if you decided to just stay. So if we take the divergent timeline thing seriously, there is a question of how this ends up working. And I've managed, through a bit of thought and cogitation, to put together a few ideas onto how that may have worked. But they you need to let go of a few sort of ideas about, whether your viewpoint is privileged. So, let's start with my first theory. We assume that the timeline, which we will call alpha, that our alpha timeline is privileged. Because it's our alpha. First and foremost, we are the alpha. We are the ones in charge. They're not going to be shoved away by any beta. But why can't our alpha be somebody else's beta? Somebody else's divergence. Which means that when Bucky and Falcon look at the guy on the park bench, they're not looking at the Captain America of their timeline. They're looking at the beta of another universe's. They're looking at the beta timeline. They're in the beta timeline of that Steve Rogers. That Steve Rogers is from another timeline. And he's melded his way into our timeline, into our alpha. So the beta timeline off of ours goes into somebody else's universe, and then that splits off somebody else's universe. So essentially, there's a braid of captains going through an infinity of timelines. So in essence, he's stepping to the side in one universe and showing up in another, and we just happen to be somebody else's beta universe. See how that works? So it's essentially every Captain America in every universe takes one step to the side, then then the one in their universe takes a step to the side, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, the Captain America we see is another universe's Captain America, and we just happen to be somebody else. We are the alpha for the next universe over, but the beta for the next universe to our left, I guess. To your left. Which is oddly appropriate. So that's one theory. The other theory rests on breaking the assumption that our viewpoint is that of the beta universe, of the alpha universe. And this one doesn't require an infinite number of Steve Rogers, stepping to the side, making way for the Steve Rogers on their left. This one only requires that we take one step to the right ourselves. Which is to say that when we're looking out on that park bench, we're looking out on that park bench in a secondary timeline. We are embedded at that point in the beta timeline. And as such, we see the result of the divergence. We see the result of Captain America's actions. We see the result of Steve Rogers returning to Peggy Carter. We are no longer on the Alpha timeline. On that timeline, he simply never comes back. So, that I would call, I guess, the beta sidestep theory. So you have on one hand, you have the braid theory, and on the other hand, you have the beta sidestep theory. So, what does that mean? It means, for one thing, that there is no rule against ours being the destination point for some other timelines, time travelers. That's one implication of the braid theory. But the implication of the beta sidestep theory would be that the implication of the beta sidestep theory would be that everything else that takes place now takes place in the universe where Steve Rogers went back in time and lived out his life with Peggy Carter, with all the implications thereof. So that universe might have an entirely different history of events. So those are two ideas you could play with to justify the appearance of Captain America in our viewpoint timeline. So we're either alphas who are somebody else's betas, or we're following Captain America into a completely different parallel timeline, parallel universe. And that is, of course, there could also be some principle that Bruce Banner, smart as he is, or Tony Stark, smart as he was, spoilers, just didn't understand. There might be some little rule, some little thing that would allow, the timelines to converge and everything to be kind of reunited. But that's not available information. I'm trying to work with available information here. So, in essence, that is my theory on how Steve Rogers shows up on that park bench. And both theories, I think, have some profound implications for what happens next in the Marvel Universe. So, thank you very much, and have a good day.